faff echoes of humanity in a galaxy forlorn. What if the greatest war in all the Imperium's 10,000 years of bleeding history was never fought with bolter rounds or chain teeth, but in the silent chambers of the human heart, where despair claws at the edges of sanity and the will to survive becomes the only weapon left? In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the most profound battlefield exists not on burning worlds or void-choked space, but in the trembling hands of a child clutching a salvaged toy, in the whispered prayers of a man who has forgotten the Emperor's name, but not the shape of hope, in the eyes of a woman who plants seeds in irradiated soil, knowing she will never taste the harvest. This is not a tale of Primarchs or God engines. This is the story of humanity's last echo, reverberating through a galaxy that has long forgotten how to listen. I was there when the silence came to Vellum's reach. The datasphere called it a minor loss, a footnote in the Administratum's endless ledgers, a world that failed to meet its tithe 3 cycles in succession and was subsequently marked for censure and potential abandonment. But I was there, in the choking ash, fall of its final days, and I bore witness to something the Imperium's scribes could never quantify, something that defied every tactical doctrine and strategic assessment I had memorized during my years serving the Officio Prefectus. I watched humanity die not with a scream, but with a song. It was a nursery rhyme half-remembered, sung by a woman whose name I never learned, whose face was caked with the gray powder of her city's cremated buildings. She stood in what remained of a market square, surrounded by the skeletal husks of habs that had once housed 40,000 souls, and she sang to the dozen children huddled against her legs. Her voice cracked on every third word. Blood leaked from her ears where the shockwave of an orbital bombardment had ruptured something vital. But she sang, and the children, those hollow-eyed remnants of a generation that would never see adulthood, sang with her. The song was older than the Imperium itself, or so the local Ministorum priest had told me before he died with his spine bent backward across the altar of his ruined chapel. It spoke of green fields and golden suns, of mothers who tucked their children into soft beds, of fathers who returned from their labor with smiles instead of the 1,000-yard stare of the munitions worker. It was a lie, of course. Vellum's reach had never known such peace. Its surface was a patchwork of strip, mines, and industrial sprawl, its skies perpetually choked with the effluent of manufactorums that churned out lasgun power packs for wars being fought on the other side of the segmentum. The children who learned that song learned it from grandparents who had learned it from their grandparents, an unbroken chain of transmission that stretched back through millennia of suffering to some mythical age that might never have existed at all. But the woman sang it anyway, and in that moment, surrounded by death and the approaching shadow of extinction, the lie became the most powerful truth I had ever encountered. I was a Commissar then, attached to the Astra Militarum regiments attempting to evacuate what remained of the planetary government before the Terranid splinter fleet made planetfall. My duties were clear and my purpose was singular: maintain order, enforce discipline, execute cowards and traitors without hesitation or remorse. I had performed these duties on 17 worlds across 4 different war zones. I had shot men in the back of the head for crimes as minor as losing their last rifles or falling asleep on watch. I had ordered decimations when entire companies broke under xenos assault. I had become, in the eyes of the Imperium, an instrument of perfect utility, a living embodiment of the Emperor's will made manifest through summary judgment and the crack of a bolt pistol. But standing there in that market square, watching that woman sing to those children as the sky above us filled with ships that blotted out the sun, I felt something inside me fracture. It was not doubt, exactly. Doubt was heresy, and I had spent years training myself to recognize and exterminate such thoughts before they could take root. This was something else, something I lacked the vocabulary to articulate even to myself. It was the recognition that the Imperium, for all its vastness and power and 10,000-year endurance, had failed to preserve the one thing that gave humanity meaning. The evacuation was a catastrophe, as these things always were. The planetary governor and his inner circle secured berths aboard the last void, capable transport, abandoning millions to their fate. The Astra Militarum regiments fought a fighting retreat to the orbital elevator, losing 3 men for every meter of ground we conceded. The Tyranids came in waves that defied counting, a living carpet of chitin and hunger that consumed everything organic in their path. I watched veteran sergeants empty their lasguns into the swarm until the power packs ran dry, then draw their combat knives and die with blades in hand, buying their squads precious seconds to fall back. I watched a tank commander drive his Lemon Russ directly into a Carnifex's path, detonating his remaining ammunition in a blast that vaporized both machine and monster, but allowed his company to reach the elevator platform. I watched a Medici orderly, a woman who couldn't have been more than 19 standard years old, refuse evacuation so she could tend to the wounded who were too broken to move, knowing with absolute certainty that she would die when the Tyranids overran the aid station. These were the stories the Imperium recorded, the tales of heroism, sacrifice that would be inscribed in regimental histories and commemorated in stained glass windows on distant shrine worlds. But they were not the story that haunted me. The woman in the market square never stopped singing. Even when the screams started, when the first wave of Hormagaunts crashed through the rubble at the square's eastern edge, her voice carried on. Even when the children scattered in terror and the Tyranid organisms fell upon them with scything talons that opened their small bodies like overripe fruit. She continued the song. I put a bolt round through her head before the xenos could reach her, a mercy killing that I told myself was an act of compassion, but which I knew, even then, was simply my inability to witness what would happen if I allowed her to fall into their claws. Her body crumpled into the ash, and the song died with her, and I felt something essential drain out of the universe in that moment, some fundamental quality of humanness that could never be recovered or replaced. We made it off-world, those of us who survived. The evacuation fleet translated into the warp 3 hours before the Terranid bio ships achieved orbital supremacy. Velum's reach ceased to exist as anything more than a designation on stellar charts, its entire biomass consumed and converted into more Tyrannid organisms, its cities reduced to calcium deposits in the bellies of hive ships. The Administratum updated its records. The Departamento Munitorum reassigned the surviving guard regiments. The Imperium continued its 10,000-year war against extinction without pause or reflection. And I sat in my quarters aboard the transport ship, staring at my hands, and realized that I could no longer remember the words to the song the woman had been singing. This was not an isolated incident. This was not an aberration or an anomaly or a unique confluence of tragic circumstances. This was, I came to understand over the years that followed, the fundamental condition of human existence in the 41st millennium. For every grand battle recorded in the Imperium's histories, for every glorious victory celebrated with triumph parades and commemorative monuments, there were 10,000 small defeats that passed unnoticed and unmourned. For every hero whose name was inscribed in the golden halls of remembrance, there were 10 million ordinary people who perished in silence, their lives reduced to statistical casualties, their stories evaporating into the void like breath on a frozen window. The Imperium measured its strength in ship tonnage and guard regiments, in forge worlds and hive cities, in the countless trillions of souls who labored in its service. But it could not, or would not, measure what was being lost in that grinding war of attrition against a galaxy that wanted nothing more than to tear humanity into its component atoms and scatter those atoms across the infinite dark. I began to collect them, these stories. It became my private heresy, my secret rebellion against the doctrine of my office. Wherever the Imperium sent me, Whatever war zone required the presence of a commissar to stiffen spines and instill discipline. I looked for these echoes of humanity. I found them in the strangest places. On a feudal world being consumed by an orc I met a blacksmith who continued forging agricultural tools, even as the greenskin horde razed his village, because his grandfather had taught him the craft, and he refused to let that knowledge die. On a hive world in the throes of a genestealer cult uprising, I discovered a hidden library in the Underhive where men and women who had never been taught to read gathered in secret to preserve books, salvaged from the upper spires, books that the ecclesiarchy would have burned as heretical, but which contained poetry and philosophy and histories of how humans had once lived before the Imperium's iron fist closed around their throats. On a mining colony slowly being poisoned by the very veins of ore that justified its existence, I watched a man teach his daughter to paint despite the tremors in his hands from heavy metal exposure, mixing pigments from mineral dust and showing her how to capture light and shadow on recycled parchment, creating beauty in a place where beauty had been systematically extracted and shipped off-world as industrial feedstock. None of these people were heroes in the conventional sense. They had not held the line against impossible odds or performed feats of superhuman valor. They would never have their names engraved on monuments or their deeds recounted in regimental histories. Most of them died in obscurity, crushed beneath the same vast and uncaring machinery that ground up entire worlds in service to the Imperium's survival. But they represented something that the High Lords of Terra, in their infinite strategic calculations, had failed to account for. They represented the stubborn, irrational, fundamentally human refusal to accept that existence was nothing more than service and suffering and eventual death. They represented the ghost of a species that had once reached for the stars not out of necessity or desperation, but out of wonder and curiosity and the simple desire to see what lay beyond the horizon. The ecclesiarchy taught that humanity's purpose was to serve the god emperor, that every life existed only to advance his eternal will, that individual existence was meaningless except insofar as it contributed to the species' collective survival. The Adeptus Mechanicus reduced humanity to biological components, inferior to the blessed machine, but useful when properly augmented and directed. The Administratum treated people as data points, resources to be allocated with the same consideration given to ammunition expenditure or fuel consumption. And the Astra Militarum, my own organization, valued soldiers primarily for their ability to die in sufficient numbers to achieve tactical objectives. Every institution of the Imperium, in its own way, denied the essential humanity of the people it purported to protect. Every doctrine and dogma and operational procedure reinforced the same brutal calculus: individual lives were expendable. Only the species mattered, and the species would survive through strength and discipline and the systematic suppression of anything that might interfere with the machinery of war. But the stories I collected suggested a different truth. They suggested that humanity was not surviving despite its preserved remnants of compassion and creativity and irrational hope, but because of them. That the Imperium endured not because of its ruthless efficiency and willingness to sacrifice billions, but because somewhere in the depths of every hive city and the scattered settlements of every agri-world and the cramped crew quarters of every navy vessel, people continued to be human in ways that transcended mere survival. They fell in love knowing that their partners might be conscripted and die on distant battlefields. They created art knowing it would be ignored or destroyed. They told stories knowing that those stories would be lost. They did these things not because they served the Imperium's interests, but because some spark within them insisted on continuing to burn, even when all rational calculation suggested it should be extinguished. I began to understand that the greatest threat to humanity was not the xenos or the heretic, or even the ruinous powers gnawing at reality's edges. The greatest threat was the slow erosion of everything that made life worth preserving in the first place. The Imperium could win every battle, reconquer every lost world, exterminate every alien species that threatened its borders, and still lose the war if it succeeded in transforming humanity into nothing more than a biological cog in an eternal war machine. Victory would be meaningless if the species that emerged from 10,000 years of total war no longer recognized itself, no longer remembered what it had been fighting to preserve. On Calix LV, I met a man named Jorah. He was nobody, a maintenance worker in one of the planet's countless recycling manufactorums. His job to sort through mountains of refuse and identify materials suitable for reclamation. He worked 18-hour shifts in toxic conditions that guaranteed he would not live to see his 50th year. His wife had died in childbirth. His son had been taken by the Schola Progenium, marked for evaluation and potential recruitment into the Commissariat or another branch of the Imperium's military apparatus. Jorah had every reason to embrace despair, to become one of the millions of hollow-eyed workers who performed their duties with mechanical efficiency, but no emotional investment, waiting for death with the same patience they showed for their shift and meal rations. Instead, he had covered every surface of his HAB unit with flowers. They were not real flowers, of course. The only thing that grew on Calix IV were chemical-resistant molds and the occasional mutant fungus in the lower hive levels. Jorah had crafted these flowers from scrap materials, spending his precious few hours of rest meticulously shaping twisted wire into stems, melting down colored plastic fragments into petals, teaching himself techniques that no one had shown him through trial and error, and countless failures. His HAB unit was a garden, a small and fragile defiance against the gray industrial monotony that defined every other aspect of life on his world. I asked him why he did it. He looked at me with eyes that had seen more suffering than most guard officers encountered in entire campaigns, and he said something that I recorded in my personal log and have returned to countless times in the years since. He said that his son would probably never remember him, that the Schola would strip away his memories and mold him into a tool of the Imperium, that Jorah himself would die alone and be recycled into the same manufactorum waste stream he spent his days sorting. But he also said that he refused to die without leaving something beautiful behind, even if no one would ever see it, even if it would be torn down and recycled the moment the administratum assigned his HAB unit to another worker. He said that creating beauty was the only way he knew to fight against the universe's apparent determination to reduce everything to ash and blood and meaninglessness. I thought about Jorah often in the months that followed. I thought about him when I executed a soldier for abandoning his post, when I watched cities burn under orbital bombardment, when I received reports of entire sectors falling to chaos incursions or xenos invasions. I thought about his flowers, those imperfect and fragile constructions of scrap and hope, and I wondered how many millions of similar small rebellions were occurring across the Imperium's million worlds, invisible to the grand strategists and high lords, never recorded in any official documentation, existing only in the hearts of individuals who refused to let the grinding machinery of total war obliterate every human impulse toward creation and connection and meaning. The psychological battlefield where humanity fought its true war was not the one the Imperium acknowledged or prepared its soldiers for. We trained for physical combat, for the moment when you stared down the barrel of a xenos weapon or felt the corrupting whisper of chaos in your thoughts. We drilled endlessly on weapons maintenance and tactical doctrine and the countless regulations that governed military conduct. But we received no preparation for the slow erosion of spirit that came from watching people die by the millions, from being complicit in atrocities committed in the Emperor's name, from seeing children starve because the agri-world that fed them was converted to munitions production. We were not equipped to resist the creeping realization that everything we fought to preserve was being destroyed by the very methods we employed to defend it. I had seen strong soldiers, veterans of dozens of campaigns, men and women who had faced down horrors that would have shattered civilians, break not in combat but in the quiet moments afterward. I watched a sergeant who had held her position against a chaos assault for 3 days straight, who had rallied her squad when every tactical assessment said they should retreat, who had earned a dozen commendations for valor, put her service pistol to her temple 6 months later, because she could no longer sleep without dreaming of the children they had burned in the purge of a tainted hive district. I watched a tank commander who had destroyed a Necrontomb complex single-handedly turn his weapon on his own command tent because he had finally counted up all the guard regiments he had seen fed into the meat grinder of endless war and pempulous war, and the Imperium lives in the last century than the xenos had claimed in the entire age, a entire age of strife. These were not failures of courage or discipline. These were the casualties of a war that the Imperium refused to recognize it was fighting, the war against the fundamental hopelessness of human existence in a galaxy that offered no comfort, no respite, no promise that anything would ever get better. And yet humanity endured. Not the Imperium's version of humanity, not the idealized servitors in flesh that the Administratum calculated with such precision, but the real, messy, irrational humanity that continued to find reasons to continue despite every rational argument for surrender. On a plague world where 70% of the population had succumbed to a Nurgle, blessed contagion, I found a woman tending to disease victims in a makeshift quarantine zone, changing their bandages and bringing them water and sitting with them when they died, because she believed that no one should die alone, even though she knew she would inevitably contract the disease herself. On a fortress world that had been under siege for 8 years, I discovered that the defenders had established a school in the deepest bunker levels, teaching children born during the siege to read and write and calculate basic mathematics, because their parents insisted that even if they all died when the walls finally fell, those children deserved to know they were more than ammunition for the Imperium's endless war machine. These were not the actions of people who had accepted the Imperium's doctrine that individual lives were meaningless. These were the actions of people who had looked into the abyss of cosmic horror and meaninglessness and decided that the appropriate response was not to surrender, to despair, but to assert meaning through their own choices, to create pockets of humanity and compassion and beauty in a universe that seemed designed to make such things impossible. They were fighting a different war than the one the Commissariat trained me for, and they were winning battles that would never appear in any strategic assessment or campaign history. I remember the day I truly understood the nature of this hidden war. It was on Gast, a death world whose surface was scarred by acid storms and whose population lived in sealed hive, structures that descended kilometers into the planet's crust. The world had been tithed for its mining output, precious metals and rare earths that were essential for the Adeptus Mechanicus's forge worlds. The work was brutal. The life expectancy for miners was measured in years rather than decades, and the Administratum's efficiency calculations indicated that it was more cost-effective to work the population to death and import new workers than to invest in improved safety measures or life support systems. I was there to investigate reports of declining productivity, to determine if discipline had become lax and whether summary executions might improve output. What I found instead was a conspiracy of memory. In the deepest mining levels, where the overseers rarely ventured and the monitoring equipment was degraded by the corrosive atmosphere, the miners had established a tradition at the end of each shift before they returned to their barracks for their 6 hours of mandated rest. They gathered in a natural cavern that their excavations had revealed. The cavern walls were covered in handprints, thousands upon thousands of them, each one belonging to a miner who had worked themselves to death in Ghost's toxic depths. Beside each handprint was a name, scratched into the stone with whatever tool had been available, and sometimes a few words. Beloved husband, gentle mother, good friend, remembered. The miners told me that the tradition had started generations ago, so long ago that no one could remember who had placed the first handprint. They told me that it was forbidden, that the overseers would have them flogged if they were discovered, that taking even those few extra minutes cut into their rest period and made the next shift that much harder to endure. But they continued the tradition anyway, because they said that a human being was more than their labor output, more than the ore they extracted, more than the years of service they provided to the Imperium before their bodies finally gave out. They said that everyone deserved to be remembered, even if that remembrance consisted of nothing more than a handprint on a stone wall in a cavern that would itself eventually be mined away and processed into industrial feedstock. I stood in that cavern for hours, running my hands over those names, reading the brief epitaphs that represented entire lives reduced to a few scratched words. I thought about my duties as a commissar, about the regulations I was supposed to enforce, about the report I was supposed to file recommending disciplinary action for this unauthorized gathering and the waste of productive minutes it represented. And I realized that if I performed those duties, if I crushed this small and fragile act of remembrance in the name of efficiency and discipline, I would be committing a greater crime against humanity than any xenos invasion or heretic uprising could achieve. I would be helping the Imperium erase the last traces of what made humanity worth preserving in the first place. I filed my report. I stated that productivity decline was due to equipment degradation and recommended increased maintenance allocations. I made no mention of the cavern or the handprints or the conspiracy of memory. It was a small act of rebellion, trivial in the grand scope of the Imperium's operations, but it was the first time I had consciously chosen to place human dignity above operational efficiency. It would not be the last. The Imperium's official doctrine held that the Emperor of Mankind, from his throne on Terra, sustained humanity through his eternal vigilance. The Astronomicans light-guided ships through the warp, the Adeptus Custodes maintained their 10,000-year vigil, and every prayer offered in every chapel on every world theoretically strengthened the Emperor's divine presence. I had believed this once, in the same unreflective way I had believed that the sky was black and lasguns, kicked when fired and traitors deserved death. But the more I traveled, the more I witnessed, the more I began to question whether the Emperor's will was truly what sustained humanity, or whether it was something else entirely, something that the Imperium's theologians and strategists had never properly understood. On a shrine world dedicated to the Emperor's worship, I attended a service where a preacher spoke of the Emperor's love for humanity, his eternal sacrifice, the necessity of faith and obedience and suffering in his name. The congregation numbered in the thousands, all of them dressed in penitents' robes, many bearing ritual scars from their devotions. They prayed with fervor that bordered on hysteria, begging the Emperor to notice their suffering, to validate their existence, to grant them some sign that their lives of brutal hardship served a greater purpose. And I realized that they were worshiping not out of love but out of terror, that their faith was not a source of strength but a desperate attempt to impose meaning on lives that offered none, that they clung to the Emperor the way a drowning man clings to debris in a storming sea. But then I walked through the shrine world streets afterward, and I saw things that the preacher had not mentioned. I saw a man sharing his meager food with a stranger. I saw children playing in an alley, inventing games from nothing, laughing despite the fact that they would grow up to be either conscripted into the guard or put to work in one of the shrine world's countless workshops, manufacturing devotional objects. I saw an old woman teaching a young girl to embroider, passing on a skill that served no tactical purpose and generated no measurable economic value, but which connected them across generations in a way that no imperial doctrine could replicate. These people were not sustained by the Emperor's divine will. They were sustained by their connections to each other, by the small acts of kindness and creativity that they managed to preserve despite the Imperium's systematic efforts to reduce them to nothing more than biological resources. Perhaps, I thought, humanity had survived not because of the Imperium, but despite it. Perhaps the real miracle was not that the Emperor endured, but that humanity had retained enough of itself, even after 10,000 years of grinding oppression and endless war, to continue being recognizably human. Perhaps every prayer that ascended from those trillion throats was not reaching the golden throne at all, but was instead echoing between human hearts, creating networks of compassion and meaning that existed parallel to the Imperium's official structures, invisible to its censors and bureaucracies, but more essential to humanity's survival than any battle fleet or fortress world. This was dangerous thinking, the kind of speculation that could earn a Commissar a bolt round from his own weapon if he voiced it too loudly. But I could not unthink it once the thought had formed. I began to see the Imperium differently, not as humanity's protector, but as its parasite, a vast structure that had grown up around humanity like a chrysalis and then refused to let the species emerge, keeping it perpetually trapped in a state of trauma and fear and stunted development, because that state served the Imperium's interests even as it slowly poisoned everything human about the species it claimed to defend. I met a man on Viridia Prime who had spent 20 years composing a symphony. He was a manufacturing worker, his hands permanently scarred from the machinery he operated, his hearing damaged by decades of industrial noise. He had no formal musical training, no access to instruments beyond a crude wooden pipe he had carved himself, no notation system beyond a personal cipher he had invented. He hummed his symphony while he worked, memorizing each movement, refining it in the endless hours of repetitive labor. He told me he would never perform it, that it would die with him when his body finally gave out, that no one would ever know it had existed. But he composed it anyway, because the act of creation itself was an assertion that he was more than his function, more than the widgets he produced or the rations he consumed or the space he occupied in the manufacturum's efficiency calculations. I met a woman on Seraphis VI who collected stories. She had no formal education, could barely read, but she had a prodigious memory and a gift for narrative. She wandered the underhive, listening to the people the Imperium had discarded, the injured who could no longer work, the elderly who had outlived their utility, the children born with mutations too minor to warrant execution but too obvious to allow normal lives. She collected their stories and memorized them and retold them to others, creating an oral history of the forgotten and the despised. She told me that the Imperium recorded the deeds of heroes and the names of the powerful, but that someone needed to remember everyone else, all the ordinary people whose lives were ground up in the machinery of survival, whose suffering went unnoticed, and whose deaths generated no memorial or monument. I met a priest on Calderon's Rest who had stopped preaching the imperial creed. He still wore his robes and maintained his chapel, but when people came to him for spiritual guidance, he no longer spoke of duty and sacrifice and the emperor's divine will. Instead, he talked about compassion. He helped people navigate their grief, offered comfort that was not contingent on their value to the Imperium, suggested that their lives might have meaning independent of their service to the species' survival. He told me he had realized that the imperial creed, as it was typically preached, was a theology of despair that transformed the emperor into a weapon for beating people into submission. He said he believed the emperor, if he truly loved humanity, would care more about the woman who sang to children in a burning city than about the strategic value of the world she died on. These people were heretics by the Commissariat's standards, or would be if anyone in authority bothered to notice them. They were failing to conform to the Imperium's ideological requirements, failing to subordinate their individual existence to the collective good, failing to accept that their purpose was to serve and suffer and die without complaint or reflection. But they were also, I increasingly believed, the only reason humanity deserved to survive at all. Because what was the point of surviving if the survivors were so transformed by the process that they retained nothing of what had made humanity worth preserving? What victory meant anything if it was purchased by becoming indistinguishable from the xenos horrors the Imperium fought against? The more worlds I visited, the more I documented these hidden acts of resistance against the slow death of the human spirit. On Forge worlds where tech, priests preached that flesh was weak and augmentation was the path to perfection, I found workers who secretly maintained biological gardens in concealed chambers, growing flowers and vegetables not because they were more efficient than synthetic alternatives, but because tending something alive connected them to a past before the Mechanicus had colonized their planet. On feudal worlds that the Imperium maintained in deliberate technological stagnation, I discovered oral traditions that preserved fragments of humanity's lost history, songs and poems that spoke of the dark age of technology, not as a cautionary tale about pride and hubris, but as a reminder that humanity had once reached heights the Imperium insisted were impossible or heretical to aspire toward. On an ocean world where the population lived in floating hive cities and harvested the seas for protein that fed a dozen nearby sectors, I met a woman who taught children to swim. This was not part of any official curriculum. Swimming served no productive purpose for people who would spend their entire lives on stable platforms, and the woman risked punishment for diverting children's attention from their assigned educational programming. But she taught them anyway, taking them to restricted areas where they could access the water, showing them how to float and dive and move through that alien environment. She told me that humans had evolved beside water, that some ancestral part of the species remembered oceans and rivers and rain, and that learning to swim was a way of connecting to that deep past, to a time before the Imperium and the Emperor, and the endless war for survival had transformed humanity into something desperate and diminished. I collected hundreds of these stories over the years. They filled data, slates that I kept encrypted and hidden, knowing that if they were discovered I would be executed for dereliction of duty, if not outright heresy. I was supposed to be identifying threats to the Imperium's stability and eliminating them with prejudice. Instead, I was documenting evidence of humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender its essential nature, and I had come to believe that these acts of quiet resistance were more vital to humanity's survival than any fortress or battle fleet. But documentation was not enough. Stories preserved in encrypted data, slates would die with me, would be lost when my body was eventually consigned to a crematorium or left to rot on whatever battlefield finally claimed me. If these echoes of humanity were to survive, they needed to be transmitted, taught, passed on to others who might continue the work of remembering when I was gone. I began to take risks. When I encountered young officers who showed signs of questioning the Imperium's more brutal doctrines, I engaged them in conversations that skirted the edge of heresy, planting seeds that might grow into more expansive thinking. When I inspected guard regiments, I looked for soldiers who maintained small personal rituals, who carried trinkets or wrote letters, or found ways to preserve their individuality, despite the military's systematic efforts to erase such things, and I made a point of not punishing these minor infractions of regulations. When I filed reports with the Commissariat, I omitted certain details, failed to mention certain violations, constructed narratives that protected people whose only crime was insisting on remaining human in circumstances designed to strip away their humanity. It was a dangerous game. The Commissariat maintained its authority through absolute consistency, through the threat that any deviation from doctrine would be met with immediate and terminal consequences. If I was discovered, If my superiors realized I had been selectively enforcing regulations and concealing information in official reports, I would be executed as a traitor. My name would be erased from all records, my service dishonored, and everything I had tried to preserve would be lost. But I had reached a point where I could no longer perform my duties, as they had been defined for me, could no longer participate in the systematic destruction of human dignity that the Imperium called necessary for survival. On Tertius Majoris, I was assigned to oversee the evacuation of a hive city that was being abandoned due to catastrophic reactor failure in the lower levels. The evacuation was a logistical nightmare, millions of people being processed through choke points with insufficient transport capacity, resources stretched beyond breaking, and the ever-present threat that radiation would breach containment and kill everyone before the evacuation could be completed. My orders were clear: maintain order, prioritize essential personnel, authorize lethal force against anyone who attempted to board transports without proper authorization. The administratum had calculated that approximately 40% of the population could be evacuated before the reactor breached. The rest would be left behind to die. I watched the evacuation proceed according to plan for 3 days. I watched families torn apart as some members received evacuation authorization and others did not. I watched fights break out at boarding ramps as people realized they had been condemned to death by bureaucratic lottery. I watched parents try to smuggle their children onto transports, watched guards drag those children away, watched the parents choose between boarding themselves or dying with their children. I watched the Imperium's survival calculus translated into human suffering on a scale that made previous atrocities seem gentle by comparison. On the 4th day, I commandeered a transport. I invoked my authority as a commissar, claimed the vessel was needed for urgent military purposes, and redirected it to a district that had been marked low priority for evacuation. I spent 6 hours filling that transport with people who had no authorization, no legitimate claim to escape, people who were supposed to be left behind to die because the administratum's algorithms had determined their survival was not cost-effective. I packed them in past the vessel's rated capacity, crammed them into cargo holds and maintenance corridors, ignored every safety regulation and protocol. When the transport lifted off, it carried nearly 3,000 people who would otherwise have died. I falsified the flight logs, created fictional authorizations, constructed a bureaucratic paper trail that would hopefully deflect any investigation. I knew I had crossed a line that I could never step back across. I had directly violated orders, subverted the Imperium's resource allocation decisions, and saved people that the administratum had designated as acceptable losses. If I was discovered, there would be no defense, no argument I could make that would satisfy my superiors. I had committed treason, had placed individual human lives above the Imperium's interests, had chosen compassion over duty. I waited for the investigation, for the summons to appear before a disciplinary tribunal, for the bolt round that would end my career and my life. It never came. The chaos of the evacuation, the millions of people being processed and transported and documented, provided sufficient cover for my actions. The transport I had commandeered was absorbed into the general flood of refugee vessels, its cargo of unauthorized evacuees disappearing into the Imperium's vast population where individual identities meant nothing and no one would think to verify that everyone aboard had proper documentation. I had gotten away with it through a combination of bureaucratic incompetence and the simple fact that the administratum cared more about aggregate numbers than individual stories. But I knew I could not repeat such an action. I had been fortunate, impossibly so, and fortune was not something a rational person relied upon in the 41st millennium. If I attempted something similar again, I would be caught, and my death would serve as an object lesson that would make conditions worse for anyone else who might be tempted to place human compassion above institutional efficiency. I needed to be more subtle, more strategic in how I worked against the machinery that was slowly grinding humanity into dust. I began to understand my role differently. I was not a commissar enforcing the Imperium's will. I was a subversive operating within the Imperium's structures, using my authority to create spaces where humanity could survive. When I inspected regiments, I looked for officers who balanced discipline with genuine care for their soldiers, and I ensured those officers received favorable reports that would advance their careers. When I encountered situations that required punishment, I calibrated my responses to achieve the minimum discipline necessary rather than the maximum terror possible. When I found people engaged in small rebellions against dehumanization, I looked the other way, pretended not to notice, allowed those rebellions to continue in the shadows of the Imperium's vast machinery. It was exhausting work, this constant calculation of how much I could protect without exposing myself, how many people I could shield without triggering the systemic responses that would crush us all. I lived with the permanent knowledge that I could be discovered at any moment, that every report I filed and every decision I made was potentially the one that would reveal my heresy. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours each night, my dreams haunted by the faces of people I had failed to save and the nightmare that my actions might ultimately harm more than they helped. On Meridian V, I encountered something that nearly broke me. The planet was an agri-world, one of billions that existed solely to feed the Imperium's endless appetite for biomass. The population lived in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery, working fields that stretched to every horizon. Their labor measured in tons of grain produced, and their worth calculated by the caloric value of their output. I was there to investigate reports of a religious movement that was spreading among the workers, a potential cult that might destabilize production. What I found was not a cult but a cargo religion, a belief system that had emerged spontaneously among people who had been denied any other form of hope. They believed that if they worked hard enough, if they exceeded their quotas consistently enough, if they proved their worth through absolute dedication to their labor, then the Imperium would reward them. They believed that transport ships would come not to collect grain, but to carry workers to paradise worlds where the Emperor's most faithful servants lived in comfort and plenty. They believed this despite the fact that no such reward had ever materialized, that their parents and grandparents had believed the same thing and died bent over the same fields, that every piece of evidence suggested the Imperium would continue to extract their labor until their bodies gave out, and then replace them with new workers who would believe the same comforting lies. The ecclesiarchy representative who accompanied me wanted to crush the movement immediately. He recognized it as a distortion of proper imperial doctrine, a heretical belief that suggested the Emperor's rewards came in life rather than in death, that human suffering had limits rather than being an eternal condition to be embraced. He drafted orders for mass executions, for the purging of the movement's leaders, and a campaign of terror that would remind the workers that their purpose was to labor and die, not to hope for anything better. I countermanded his orders. I invoked my authority as a commissar, claimed that mass executions would destabilize production more than the cargo cult, argued that the movement could be redirected rather than destroyed. The ecclesiarchy representative protested, but ultimately military authority superseded religious authority in situations defined as security threats, and I had defined this as such. I spent 3 weeks on Meridian V, meeting with the cargo cult's leaders, listening to their beliefs, understanding the psychological architecture that allowed them to continue working in conditions that should have driven them to mass suicide or rebellion. I did not try to dismantle their faith. I recognized it for what it was, a survival mechanism, a way of imposing meaning on meaningless suffering, a psychological defense against the slow, grinding horror of their existence. Instead, I modified it. I introduced elements of orthodox imperial doctrine, reframed their beliefs so they aligned more closely with ecclesiarchy teaching, suggested that the rewards they hoped for might come in ways they had not anticipated. I turned their cargo cult into something that looked enough like standard imperial faith, that it would not trigger further investigation while preserving the core hope that allowed them to continue functioning. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and saved everyone. The workers continued to believe in eventual reward, continued to find meaning in their labor, continued to work the fields that fed distant sectors. The ecclesiarchy accepted my modifications as adequate compliance with doctrinal requirements. Production remained stable. No one was executed. And I was left with the bitter knowledge that I had become complicit in perpetuating their exploitation, that I had chosen to preserve a comforting lie rather than to either speak a liberating truth or to end their suffering entirely. This was the reality of working within the Imperium structures. There were no clean choices, no decisions that did not involve compromise with systems I had come to despise. I could save a few thousand people here, protect a small community there, preserve scattered fragments of human dignity in the cracks between the Imperium's grinding gears. But I could not change the fundamental nature of the machine. I could not dismantle the structures that transformed human beings into resources to be consumed. I could not offer any vision of a future that was genuinely better rather than marginally less horrific. The question that haunted me, that I turned over in my mind during the long hours of transit between war zones, was whether my actions meant anything at all. Was I actually preserving humanity, or was I simply extending the species' suffering by allowing people to cling to the last vestiges of their humanity, rather than letting them surrender to the efficient numbness that the Imperium offered? Was there any meaningful difference between the Imperium's path and mine, when both led ultimately to the same destination of extinction or transformation into something no longer recognizably human? I found my answer, or at least the beginning of one, on a world whose name I never learned. It was not significant enough to have a proper designation, just an alphanumeric code in the Administratum's endless catalogs. The world had been settled during the Great Crusade and subsequently forgotten. Its population left to develop without imperial oversight for nearly 3,000 years. When a navigator finally rediscovered it during a jump, what they found was a society that had diverged substantially from imperial norms. The people there had no ecclesiarchy, no commissariat, no administratum to regulate every aspect of their existence. They had developed their own culture, their own traditions, their own ways of organizing society that bore little resemblance to the Imperium's brutal hierarchy. The navigator's report triggered an immediate response. A compliance fleet was dispatched, my commissariat team included, with orders to bring the world into conformity with imperial standards. This meant dismantling their existing social structures, imposing the imperial creed, establishing the mechanisms of extraction and control that would transform them from a self-sufficient society into another component of the Imperium's war machine. It meant, essentially, destroying everything they had built over 3 millennia and replacing it with the same grinding oppression that characterized every other world in the Imperium. I arrived expecting to find a primitive society, perhaps dangerous in its deviation from imperial norms, but ultimately unsophisticated in its organization. What I found instead was a civilization that had achieved something I had thought impossible in the 41st millennium. They had created a society where human flourishing was possible. They had cities that were beautiful rather than merely functional, architecture that served aesthetic purposes rather than optimal resource efficiency. They had schools where children learned art and philosophy alongside practical skills, where education was about developing human potential rather than creating specialized workers for predetermined roles. They had systems of governance that allowed for dissent and debate, that distributed power rather than concentrating it in the hands of an authoritarian elite. They had preserved or rediscovered technologies that the Imperium had lost or forbidden. Not weapons, but tools for improving quality of life, for reducing the labor burden, for allowing people to spend their time on activities that brought them joy, rather than merely keeping them alive. They were not perfect. They had their own problems, their own inequalities and conflicts and failures. But they had created something precious, something I had thought the galaxy no longer contained, a human society that treated human dignity as valuable in itself, rather than as an obstacle to efficient resource management. They had proven that humanity could survive without the Imperium's iron fist, that the brutal calculus of total war was not the only possible response to a hostile galaxy, and we were going to destroy them. The fleet commander made this clear in the initial briefing. The population would be given the opportunity to surrender and accept integration into the Imperium. Those who resisted would be eliminated. Their technologies would be confiscated, their records seized and delivered to the Adeptus Mechanicus for evaluation, their cities repurposed as standard imperial settlements. Within a generation, their culture would be erased, their children indoctrinated into imperial doctrine, their society transformed into just another world grinding out its tithe of resources and conscripts for the Imperium's endless wars. I sat through that briefing feeling something fundamental shift inside me. I had spent years documenting humanity's small resistances against dehumanization, protecting scattered individuals and communities where I could, working within the Imperium's structures to preserve fragments of human dignity. But I had always maintained the fiction that I was still serving the Imperium's ultimate interests, that my small rebellions were justified by the greater goal of humanity's survival. Watching the fleet commander describe how we would systematically dismantle a functional human society, listening to him justify this destruction with the same doctrine I had once unquestioningly accepted, I could no longer maintain that fiction. The Imperium was not protecting humanity. It was preventing humanity from being anything other than what it had become. A traumatized species locked in eternal war against threats both real and imagined, unable to envision any future except more war, more suffering, more gradual erosion of everything that made human existence meaningful. I did something unforgivable. I transmitted a warning to the planet's surface before the compliance fleet entered high orbit. I used encrypted channels, routed through systems that would take investigators months to trace back to me, and I told them what was coming. I gave them technical data on Imperial weapons and tactics. I suggested strategies for resistance that might allow them to survive the initial assault. I committed treason on a scale that dwarfed my previous acts of covert rebellion, and I did it with full knowledge of what it meant and what consequences would follow. The compliance operation became a war. The population fought with a sophistication that surprised the fleet commander, employing tactics that seemed to anticipate Imperial strategy. Defending positions that standard doctrine said they should not have been able to identify as critical. The operation that was supposed to take weeks extended into months. Casualties mounted on both sides. I participated in the ground campaign, performing my duties as a commissar, maintaining order and discipline among the guard regiments while knowing that every day the defenders held out was a day I had helped them survive. They lost eventually. They were a single, isolated world facing the full might of an Imperial compliance fleet. No amount of warning or tactical advice could overcome that disparity in resources and firepower. Their cities fell one by one. Their population was decimated, their society shattered. Those who survived long enough to surrender were integrated into the Imperium with the brutal efficiency I had witnessed on countless other worlds. Within months, the process of cultural erasure had begun. Their children were separated from their parents and placed in Schola facility, where they would be indoctrinated with Imperial doctrine. Their technologies were confiscated. Their history was rewritten to cast their previous isolation as a dark age of ignorance, rather than 3 millennia of independent development. I was discovered. The investigation that traced my warning took 6 months, but eventually the trail led back to me. I was arrested, stripped of my rank, and detained pending trial before a commissariat tribunal. The charges were comprehensive treason, conspiracy, violation of multiple articles of military law, heresy by association, and dereliction of duty. The evidence was incontrovertible. I had no defense that any tribunal would accept, no argument that would mitigate my crimes. I was going to be executed, and my death would be used as an object lesson to reinforce the principle that no one, regardless of rank or service record, was above the Imperium's law. I spent 3 weeks in a detention cell waiting for my trial, and I used that time to organize my thoughts into a document that I hoped might survive my execution. I wrote about everything I had witnessed, all the stories I had collected, all the evidence I had accumulated that humanity was fighting 2 wars simultaneously. The external war against xenos and heretics that consumed the Imperium's resources and attention, and the internal war against the slow death of the human spirit that the Imperium itself was perpetrating. I wrote about the woman who sang to children in a burning city, about Jorah and his flowers, about the miners who left handprints on cavern walls, about all the small and fragile acts of resistance against dehumanization that I had documented over the years. I wrote about my belief that these echoes of humanity were more essential to the species' survival than any fortress or fleet. That the real threat was not extinction, but transformation into something no longer worth preserving. I knew the document would likely be destroyed unread, that the commissariat would classify it as the ravings of a traitor and ensure it never reached anyone who might be influenced by its contents. But I wrote it anyway, because the act of writing was itself a form of resistance. Because putting these thoughts into permanent form was a way of asserting that they mattered even if no one would ever read them. Because I refused to die without leaving some record of what I had learned and what I had tried, however imperfectly, to preserve. My trial never happened. 2 days before it was scheduled to convene, the detention facility was attacked. I initially assumed it was enemy action, some xenos raid or chaos incursion that had breached the planet's defenses. But the attackers moved with too much precision, struck too specifically at the facility's weak points, extracted me too efficiently from my cell and transported me off-world too smoothly for this to be anything but a planned operation by people with detailed knowledge of Imperial security protocols. They were guard officers, every one of them someone I had encountered during my years as a commissar, a lieutenant I had declined to execute for a minor breach of regulations, a captain whose unorthodox tactics I had defended in official reports, a major who had maintained a small library of forbidden literature that I had discovered and then pretended not to notice, a colonel who had prioritized evacuating civilians during a planetary assault when regulations required him to focus solely on military objectives, whose career I had protected by falsifying after-action reports. Dozens of officers who had been preserved or protected or inspired by my small rebellions against the Imperium's dehumanizing machinery, who had been paying attention to what I did rather than what I said, who had recognized in my actions a different vision of what the Imperium might be, or what might exist beyond the Imperium's boundaries. They took me to a ship, a small transport that had been reported destroyed months earlier, but which had actually been diverted and hidden, its crew replaced with personnel sympathetic to the cause these officers represented. They told me that my document had been transmitted before it could be destroyed, that copies had been distributed through covert channels to sympathetic parties across multiple sectors, that my words had reached people who were tired of the Imperium's brutal calculus and hungry for any vision that suggested humanity might be more than the traumatized species the Imperium had forged through 10,000 years of endless war. They told me about networks that existed in the Imperium's shadows, informal connections between people who maintained their humanity despite systematic efforts to strip it away, who practiced small acts of compassion and creativity and resistance, who preserved the echoes I had been documenting. They told me these networks had existed for centuries, perhaps longer, but had operated in isolation, each cell unaware of the others, convinced they were alone in their rebellion. My document had provided a framework for understanding what they were doing, had given them language to articulate their resistance, had suggested that their small acts were not futile gestures, but essential contributions to a different kind of war. They told me they were deserters, every one of them, that they had abandoned their posts and forsaken their oaths to the Imperium. They told me they were establishing settlements in the void spaces between sectors on forgotten worlds, that the administratum had lost track of, in places where they could attempt to build something resembling the society I had found on that nameless world, something that prioritized human dignity over operational efficiency. They told me I was not the first person they had extracted from imperial custody, that there were hundreds of others scattered across their hidden settlements, people who had committed similar crimes of compassion and been marked for execution. They asked me to join them. They offered me a choice that I had thought was no longer possible in the galaxy, the choice to step outside the Imperium's machinery entirely, to stop trying to work within structures designed to perpetuate the very dehumanization I opposed, to attempt something genuinely different even if that attempt would likely fail and result in our deaths. I accepted. What else could I do? I had spent years documenting humanity's echoes, protecting them where I could, but always within the constraints of the Imperium's overwhelming power. I had reached the limit of what could be accomplished through covert rebellion and selective enforcement. If humanity's essential nature was to survive, if the species was to be anything more than the brutalized remnant the Imperium was forging, then someone had to attempt to preserve genuine alternatives, to create spaces where human flourishing was possible, to demonstrate that the Imperium's path was not the only option even if every alternative was impossibly dangerous. We fled into the void, a small transport carrying deserters and traitors and a few hundred civilians who had been extracted from worlds where they would otherwise have died unremarked and forgotten. We carried with us no weapons beyond what was necessary for self-defense, no resources beyond what we had been able to salvage or steal, no guarantee that we would survive long enough to establish anything permanent. We carried only ourselves, our skills, our memories of what humanity had been and might become again, and a stubborn refusal to accept that the Imperium's vision was inevitable. The settlement we established on a dead world in an unmapped system became my home for the next 18 years. We built it from salvage and desperation, constructing habitats that were barely sufficient to support life, scratching agriculture from soil that had never known organic growth, and maintaining systems that should have failed a dozen times, but which we somehow kept functioning through improvisation and determination. We had none of the Imperium's resources, none of its infrastructure or support systems. We should have failed within months, should have succumbed to any of the 1,000 ways that unprotected humans could die in a hostile galaxy. But we survived, and more than that, we began to thrive in ways that would have seemed impossible to any imperial strategist. We created a society where people had value independent of their productive output, where children learned art alongside practical skills, where the elderly were cared for rather than being recycled when they could no longer work. We made mistakes, had conflicts and failures and setbacks. We buried people who died from accidents or illnesses that proper imperial medical facilities could have treated. We lived with the constant fear that we would be discovered, that the Imperium would find us and crush our small rebellion with the same casual brutality. It applied to every other deviation from its norms. But we also experienced something I had forgotten was possible. We experienced joy. Not the grim satisfaction of duty performed or the brief respite between horrors, but genuine joy that came from living in a way that honored human dignity. We had festivals where people created art for no purpose except the pleasure of creation. We had relationships that formed from mutual attraction rather than breeding quotas. We had children who grew up knowing that they were valued for themselves rather than for their potential utility to some vast imperial machinery. I watched those children play, watched them invent games and tell stories and develop personalities that had nothing to do with military discipline or industrial efficiency. I watched them grow into adults who had never known the particular kind of trauma that characterized every generation raised in the Imperium, who took for granted freedoms that I had spent decades learning to recognize as precious. And I understood that this, not the grand battles or the massive fleets or the Emperor's eternal vigil, was what humanity's survival actually meant. It meant preserving the possibility that human beings could flourish rather than merely endure, could create rather than merely consume, could choose their own purposes rather than having purposes imposed upon them. Other settlements appeared over the years, other groups of deserters and refugees who had fled the Imperium's machinery. We established contact cautiously, built networks of trade and communication, shared resources and knowledge. We were tiny compared to the Imperium's vastness, a few 100,000 people scattered across dozens of settlements in void spaces that official charts listed as empty. We posed no military threat, had no ambition to challenge the Imperium's dominance, wanted only to be left alone to attempt our own path. But we represented something the Imperium could not tolerate. We represented proof that its brutal calculus was not necessary, that humanity could survive without the systematic suppression of human dignity, that the price the Imperium demanded for protection might be too high. If our existence became widely known, if people across the Imperium's million worlds learned that alternatives were possible, it might trigger questions that the Imperium's authorities could not afford to allow. I knew discovery was inevitable. The galaxy was too thoroughly mapped, the Imperium's sensors too comprehensive, our settlements too numerous to remain hidden forever. I spent my final years preparing for that inevitability, ensuring that what we had learned and built would survive in some form even after the Imperium crushed our physical settlements. We created records, detailed documentation of our societies and how they functioned, proof that human beings could organize themselves differently than the Imperium's model. We trained young people in techniques for preserving information covertly, for distributing ideas through channels that the Imperium's sensors might not intercept. We prepared our population for the possibility that they might need to scatter, to return to the Imperium's worlds, and carry what they had learned back into its population, planting seeds that might not grow for generations, but which represented the possibility of eventual transformation. I am old now, my body failing in ways that proper Imperial Juvenat treatments would have prevented, my time measured in months rather than years. I sit in a settlement that may not exist by the time anyone reads these words, writing a conclusion to a document that began as a heretic's confession and became something else entirely. I write with the knowledge that the Imperium may find us tomorrow, may send warships to obliterate these settlements and execute every person who dared to step outside its control. I write knowing that everything we built may be erased, may leave no trace except perhaps these words scattered through the data streams of a galaxy too vast for any authority to completely control. But I also write with hope, a word I learned to fear during my years as a Commissar, but which I have reclaimed in the decades since. Hope that the echoes of humanity I spent my life documenting are not mere remnants of a dying species, but seeds of a potential renewal. Hope that somewhere in the Imperium's vastness, on worlds whose names I will never know, people are performing the same small acts of resistance that I witnessed across decades of service. Hope that these acts, accumulating across millions of worlds and billions of people, represent a tide that even the Imperium's massive inertia cannot permanently resist. The woman who sang to children in a burning city, Jorah with his flowers, the miners with their handprints, the man composing his symphony, the woman collecting stories, all the countless individuals who insisted on remaining human despite every pressure to surrender that humanity. They were not anomalies or exceptions. They were the truth of what humanity is when stripped of the Imperium's imposed identity. They were echoes of something older and more fundamental than the 10,000-year nightmare that passes for civilization in the 41st millennium. This is not a story about heroes or villains, about triumph or defeat. This is a story about survival of a different kind, about the fight to preserve not just humanity's physical existence, but its essential nature. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the greatest act of rebellion is simply to insist that human beings are more than weapons, more than resources, more than expendable components in a vast machine grinding toward an uncertain future. The Imperium will call this heresy. By every definition it holds sacred, that judgment is correct. I have betrayed my oaths, abandoned my duties, and dedicated my life to undermining the structures I once served. But I believe, with a certainty that has only grown stronger as my body has grown weaker, that the real heresy is what the Imperium has done to humanity, the slow and systematic murder of everything that makes human existence meaningful. If you are reading this, you have already made a choice whether you recognize it or not. You have chosen to receive information that the Imperium would classify as dangerous, to expose yourself to ideas that challenge the doctrines you were taught to accept without question. You cannot unlearn what you now know, that humanity survived 10,000 years not because of the Imperium's brutal efficiency, but despite it. That the echoes of compassion and creativity and irrational hope that persist across a million worlds are not weaknesses to be purged, but strengths to be cultivated. That the war humanity needs to win is not against the xenos or the heretic, but against the forces, internal and external, that would transform us into something no longer worth preserving. What you do with that knowledge is your choice. You may reject it, may classify these words as the ravings of a traitor, and return to your duties with renewed dedication to the Imperium's doctrine. You may accept it but feel powerless to act, may carry it as a burden of knowledge that brings no possibility of change. Or you may recognize in these words an echo of something you already knew, already felt, already practiced in whatever small ways your circumstances allowed. If you are the third kind of person, then know this, you are not alone. Across the Imperium's vastness, on worlds separated by light, years and sectors and gulfs of time, others are fighting the same quiet war you are. Others are preserving fragments of human dignity, creating small spaces where compassion survives, teaching their children that they are more than their utility to the imperial war machine. These acts seem futile in isolation, seem insignificant against the Imperium's overwhelming power and the galaxy's vast hostility. But they accumulate, they connect, they create networks of humanity that exist parallel to the Imperium's official structures, invisible to its censors but more essential to the species' survival than any battle fleet. The galaxy is a dark place, darker than my younger self could have imagined when I first donned a Commissar's uniform and swore my oaths to the Imperium. It is filled with entities that hunger for humanity's extinction or enslavement or corruption, forces so vast and terrible that the Imperium's brutal response seems almost rational in comparison. But the darkness is not absolute. Light persists, not the cold light of the Astronomicon guiding ships through the warp, not the Emperor's divine presence maintaining reality against chaos, but the small and fragile lights of human connection, compassion, creativity, and hope. These are the echoes of humanity in a galaxy forlorn. They are what remains when the Imperium's grand narratives and eternal wars are stripped away. They are what we were before the nightmare began, and what we might become again if we survive long enough and remember enough to reclaim our essential nature. Remember the song. Remember the flowers. Remember the handprints. Remember that you are more than your function, more than your designation in some vast ledger, more than a resource to be consumed in humanity's defense. Remember that you are human, and that being human means something more profound than merely surviving. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But in the spaces between battles, in the moments when the guns fall silent and the void-choked sky clears enough to glimpse stars, there are people insisting that war is not all there is, that humanity contains possibilities beyond the ones the Imperium has permitted. These are the echoes. Listen for them, preserve them, become them. They are all that stands between humanity and the final silence that awaits every species that forgets why it wanted to survive in the first place.